This session is called Global Governance. In fact, we'll be talking about governance at two levels, I suppose, the nation state and global governance. The moderator is always obliged to say that he has a distinguished panel. Today, that's an understatement. We have on my far left Mario Monti, who was Prime Minister of Italy at the height of the Euro crisis and squeezed more experience on governance into those years than than Frank could in his long books about the origins of political order. Mitch Julis, to my left, is with Canyon Partners, a co-founder. He's on the board of the Woodrow Wilson School. Canyon manages $25 billion in assets, and they specialize in distressed assets. So he's particularly equipped to talk about democratic governance. To my right is Frank Fukuyama, who everyone knows from his famous end of history thesis. And he's written a very magisterial book, I would say, on the origins of political order, part one so far, another part coming, and also is writing a book on dysfunctional democracy at the moment. Neil Ferguson, our other globally famous intellectual, I think everyone knows. He's at Harvard now, and Neil has just written a book on the degeneration of institutions, and the great degeneration, how institutions decay and economies die. And he's
very cheerful subject.
And he's also doing a biography of Henry Kissinger. So what I'd like to do today is start with some brief comments to frame the discussion about governance. In any system of accountable governance, there's a central tension between the long-term interests of the community and the short-term, based on populist impulses of the public and special interest. Now, in an autocratic system like China, its strength is the capacity to forge consensus and unity of purpose with the institutional capacity to implement policies over the long term. We've seen over the past 30 years China raise hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. We'll see in the coming years that China will be able to link 80% of its cities with a high bullet train network. Its downfall, of course, and its weakness is absent direct popular accountability, absent transparency, absent of free media. It tends to become hidebound and corrupt, beholden to princeling nepotism or state capitalist cronyism. The strength of a democracy like the United States is everyone has a voice, everyone gets contended for power. But our incapacity to forge consensus out of the multitude of interests, out of the cacophony of voices, has led to gridlock. Our adversarial political system has degenerated into outright partisan rancor and paralysis. The formal mechanism of accountability, one person, one vote democracy, has been captured by the short-term mentality of voters on the one hand, and as Frank has called it, the vetocracy of special interests on the other. Veto-ocracy, like democracy, veto-ocracy. Special interests that want to preserve the status quo in order to protect their spoils. Now, in addition, in some places, notably the United States, and I would say Italy, we've shifted from an industrial democracy which saved more than it spent, which financed the safety net, which invested in infrastructure, to a consumer democracy. In the consumer democracy, all the feedback signals are short-term, media, market, politics, and tend to steer behavior toward immediate gratification. Now, the perfect example, I guess the best illustration for our discussion today of this short-term, long-term tension is Gerhard Schröder's case in Germany. In 2003, Gerhard Schröder was chancellor and implemented some very tough reforms on labor flexibility and welfare. And as Schröder himself often bitterly comments these days, it takes years, if not a decade, for these kind of structural changes to manifest themselves. But elections are in the near term. So Schröder was thrown out of office in the next election because of the unpopularity of his reforms. Yet 10 years later, Germany is a powerhouse of Europe precisely because of those reforms. Democracy misprices the long term. Mario Monti suffered a similar fate in Italy. At the height of the Euro crisis, Mario was stuck between the demands of the international financial markets to show some evidence of immediate structural change and the resistance of the democratic public that didn't want to pay those costs. So Mario, in many ways, suffered the same fate as Schroeder politically. His platform was turned out in the next election. And the question then becomes, how do we find that equilibrium between the long term and the short term, between what the public demands that the governments are accountable to and the need for long-term structural change for the common good of the community? So Mario, out of your crucible of your experience, maybe you can give us some wisdom.
With great pleasure, Nathan. Thank you very much. Well, it's a problem everywhere, short-termism. And now we are discussing short-termism in politics, but we all know how much damage short-termism brought into the economy and the financial markets. And by the way, the politicians, to some extent, extirpated short-termism in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere from the financial markets, but they were the victims of some contagion, because in doing so, they became more short-termists themselves. So handle with care. But in the case of European countries, and Italy, of course, is a European country, we have our own China, and our China is in Brussels. As you said, Nathan, some systems are better equipped to cater for the long term. China certainly is, although, of course, it lacks other things that we like to see and practice, like democracy in our sense of the word. Since the inception of the European communities, now the European Union, national governments, there are now 28 of them in Europe, tend to practice normal democratic systems at the national level. And they have, out of their own sovereign will, conferred upon the entity which sits in Brussels, the European Union, the task of taking away some portions of their respective sovereignties and to exercise that sovereignty in a common pool. Typically, this was the case when it was decided to set up a single market where no country was free to play with tariffs or quotas or distortions. And there was even, as early as 1958, a common single antitrust policy. Most recently, that was the story of the creation of the single currency. Prior to that, central bankers who believed they were sovereigns were not. Just the German central bank was sovereign because of its size, the size of the economy of Germany. It was the only one able to control interest rates. The other one immediately aligned within 1 or 2 minutes from the sovereign decision taken in Germany. Now, in the European treaties, the member states have gradually delegated to the higher authority, to the higher level, the European Union, the tasks which have more to do with the long term. So, monetary stability and to keep inflation low, but also the policy about environment and climate change, and also hand in hand with monetary stability, the control over the public deficit and the public debt. So if we think of it, these are all leeways that traditionally were played at the national level. Now they have been given voluntarily by the EU member states up there. Why? because these things were felt to be too serious to be left in the discretion of individual national authorities, particularly in a continent which is so integrating. This is giving rise today to very huge tensions, because the citizens, and above all the politicians at the national level, feel a bit expropriated. Now just imagine, just consider that any government in Europe has first to submit its draft budget for the subsequent year to Brussels, even before then to its national parliament. But this is felt necessary, particularly after the Greek crisis and the crisis within the Eurozone. And countries have, without much difficulty, decided that they had to allow the central entity out of Brussels to do even more together. But the populations feel alienated. And this is exploited by populisms who say, there is increasing unemployment, youth unemployment. Whose fault is that? Clearly of Europe. What would be the recipe against that? To close the economies, etc., etc. So to reproduce the catastrophe of the 30s. We can also say in Europe, and this is not idealistic, this is very real, that the European level is the best ally of younger and future generations of Europeans, precisely because it caters about the long term. One last note I'd like to make. Obviously, when countries were at the peak of the financial crisis within the Eurozone, by the way, never has it been a euro crisis. This is a mistaken word. The euro is a currency. The power of the currency you measure in terms of domestic purchasing power in goods and services, or external purchasing power in terms of exchange rate. On neither account has the euro lost ground in the last few years. As a matter of fact, many would say that now the euro is too strong, not too weak. But within the Eurozone, there has been a combination of fiscal and banking crisis. And of course, national governments had to remedy to their situation. When it was my turn to be asked to do that in November 2011, if Italy had gone down the path of Greece, it would have been impossible, for a matter of sheer size, for Europe to rescue Italy. And so we had to do it on our own. Actually, we were almost forced to accept financial assistance and to give up part of our residual sovereignty by the IMF, Europe, etc. And we said, no thanks. We want to do it with our own resources and strength. And so we did not give up sovereignty. And we can now thus contribute also with unscathed negotiating power to changing the rules in the European Union whenever it is necessary. But take the case of Italy. Italians saw a prime minister who was never a politician, called by the President of the Republic, and there was no competition. No politician applied for the job of prime minister at that time. Even though one who was at the time prime minister, Mr. Berlusconi, now says that there has been a plot to oust him. I think that never resignations were more spontaneous than the ones he handed in. And comes a hopefully respected, but not democratically elected prime minister. And what did we do? This is really my last note, Nathan, but the really last one. Consensus vitocracies. I am convinced that bold decisions in our societies and the political systems can almost only be taken through grand coalitions. We had a situation where a right and the left could hardly speak, other than for insulting themselves. I put them together in those conditions of emergency. A pension reform was sometimes tried, but the left would never accept it if done by the right. An enhanced fight against tax evasion, not an entirely absent phenomenon in my country, was always resisted by the right. I took them, we made up a package, so that the net political cost to each party relative to losing consensus in their constituencies was reduced. And I believe that those countries whose constitutional system has always been believed to be superior in terms of delivering bold decisions, i.e. the presidential republics, may now be at some disadvantages, because in their system it's almost impossible to have, other than in very exceptional circumstances, those grand coalitions that, for example, helped Germany from time to time, helped Italy. And I leave it for consideration, maybe two countries in which structural reforms, really bold ones, are proving a bit difficult these days. Aren't they the United States and France? And aren't these two examples of presidential republics?
There you go.
Well taken. Wow. So you're out of the crisis, which we won't call a Euro crisis. Europe is inventing some new political ideas. The Grand Coalition, a division of labor between Brussels and the nation state, long-term, short-term, and a discovery that populism can be against the people's interest in the long term.
You see how productive it is to have a crisis?
Yeah, I see that. Well, you're here to articulate it for us with all your wisdom, so thanks. Now, the other side of what we have called the Euro crisis, and for shorthand, I'll just say it again, is the financial markets.
Yeah.
Now, the financial markets also, as I said before, democracy mispriced the long term in the case of Schroeder. The financial markets also mispriced Southern European bonds based on European strength up until that crisis, to the sovereign debt crisis. So the other side of, if you were in Europe in those days, everyone was blaming Mario Monti, but behind Mario Monti was the global financial markets that was causing all this pain. So looking at it from, Mitch, from your standpoint of the global financial markets, is democracy becoming a risk? I said before, you're an expert in distressed assets. Is democracy a distressed asset?
So let me answer your question by providing a little context about how we make decisions. And you wouldn't know that money managers should be a so-called expert on global governance. And I really feel that in some ways, what I'm really speaking to is how people vote, right? I mean, there's voting at the polls, there's voting with your dollars, there's voting with your feet. And essentially, what you're doing, apropos your comments, is voting on different balance sheets, which represent countries or different states of the system. So when we look at Europe, for example, here's what we see. We see a group of countries which have an historical imperative to avoid war. And if Neil remembers last year in the lessons of history, we talked about the idea that as an investor, we believed that the euro was going to be kept, the euro as a currency would literally tie together the core to the periphery because of the imperative. And if you pull up slide 10, you'll see the words of Helmut Kohl that I referred to last year, which talked about the evil spirits of the past and trying to keep them away. So as an investor, you're saying, okay, the Eurozone has its issues, but there's this historical imperative to avoid war. Therefore, we have to literally bind ourselves, the core, the stronger countries, the northern or whatever you want to call them, to the Mediterranean countries, the southern countries. Okay. And that turned out to be the case. But it takes a lot of hard work by the statesmen who are not the politicians. And I'll refer to slide 5, because I think it encapsulates the service that Mr. Monti performed, because he did think like a statesman and of the next generation, as opposed to a politician. If you know, In the election of 2013, you weren't able, unfortunately, to muster the requisite percentage to install the government at that time. But you accomplished a tremendous amount because of the idea of being a statesman and not being a politician. And that goes to the short term, long term. Now, continuing on this idea, if you pull up slide 6, all these experiments that are going on in Europe and across the world can be thought of in terms of a matrix. There's representative government and authoritarian government. There's capitalism and some form of socialism or communism. And then on top of that, all those different combinations, you have monetary policy, fiscal policy, regulatory and structural issues. As you were talking about, you have an incomplete federal system in Europe. The United States has a more complete federal system, but an imperial presidency and gridlock. Which is the better system? Which balance sheet should we as an investor bet on? There's a lot of issues in that. In slide 8, you can tinker all you want with government. But as Neil might point out, and Professor Fukuyama might point out, history shows that there are a lot of imperatives that go beyond political and structural issues. There's geography. There's demography. Neil, you wrote an article about imbalanced societies where men outnumber women and what that and the political ramifications of that. And of course, there's the issues of meteorology and global warming and the geopolitical issues of oceans and seas rising and what does it mean. We take that into consideration. Finally, I'll point out on slide 11, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this further. There's the issue of geopolitics versus financial governance. And when you have a situation like the Ukraine-Russia situation, you wonder how much is being priced in the market. And there's two ways of thinking about this. George Friedman of Stratfor says that the Russian bear is going to huff and puff and blow himself up. So we have to not overreact. Let them do what they want to do for geographical reasons. Get a little distance between themselves and Western Europe, right? And their system is so unbalanced and so dependent on oil that in 2 to 3, 5 years, Europe is going to rely on other sources of natural gas. And that'll hollow out their economy. So don't do anything. Now, if you read the Wall Street Journal, they're saying much more muscular action should take place. And we see this incremental sanctions thing going on. So how do we, as an investor, price that in? We have this amazing situation where the Eurozone held itself together despite a lot of obstacles, and now there's an unexpected threat. In my mind, as an investor, and this is my last point, in my mind, and I don't know if you would agree, in my mind, the whole Ukrainian-Russian situation points out the following, that it is cheap to assist the countries that need assistance, whether it's Italy or Greece. When you think about the fact of Eurozone dismantling in the face of Russia's current policy, it seems very cheap, not just for historical reasons to avoid war between the countries of the Eurozone, but to avoid a situation where you are weak in the face of a resurgent bear. So anyway.
Excellent, thank you. Now, to continue from that on to the earlier comments about the long term, the short term, the crisis. Neil, you've written in this book, The Great Degeneration, that we degenerated from a moment in which the West was successful in keeping this balance between the long and short term. And now other places like China are being more successful in the way we used to be. What's the key dynamic behind this degeneration that you've written about?
Thanks, Nathan. It's a fascinatingly wide-ranging discussion we're having. I'm not sure we've left anything out apart from the meaning of life, which I'll explain later. The argument in The Great Degeneration is quite simple, and it's that once you've got good institutions, don't expect that they'll just stay good by themselves. I think in some ways Frank and I arrived at similar views of Western political problems from rather different angles. I thinking in terms of economic history, he thinking in terms of political institutions. But the story is essentially the same. The United States had the best institutions in the world. I think that could credibly be claimed for much of the 20th century. But the generational imbalances which lurk behind the crisis of public finance, the hypertrophic regulation which characterizes economic life, the problem of the rule of lawyers as opposed to the rule of law. Apologies if there are any lawyers. Actually, no apologies if there are lawyers in the room. And finally, the kind of degeneration of civil society, the thing that, from the vantage point of many European visitors, was the great glory of American life. These four things suggest that, by any measure, the United States no longer has the best institutions. And most of the surveys that are out there that compare countries in terms of institutional quality tell that story, whether you look at the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Index or World Governance Indicators. There are a whole bunch of these things that try to quantify institutional quality. Really the story is not good, and it's actually quite striking how much deterioration there's been. This is not much discussed in the United States, where there's still a kind of we're number one mentality. There's one other thing that I'd like to raise, though, which isn't in that book, but which is the subject of an essay I'm going to publish soon in the American Interest. I don't think we should... I was just plugging it.
Yeah,
I hope you approve. You had a very good essay in it too, Frank.
Thank you, Neil.
In many ways, I think we should resist the temptation to idealize China. And I don't actually agree with your notion that there are these wonderful long-term non-democratic systems and these dreadful short-term democratic ones. I think this is to misunderstand the world we live in. All politicians want to have 5-year plans or 4-year plans. They all campaign on the basis of such a plan. It doesn't matter whether they're Chinese communists or whether they are, in fact, Western Democrats. The impulse that politicians have is to tell you, the public, whether you vote or not, that they have a plan over that kind of a time frame that they're going to execute. And they can't. And that is because the fundamental structures of economic planning, which depend on a powerful hierarchical state, are being disrupted in our time by extraordinary networks that really are the most exciting development of modern times, but also the most disruptive one. So when a politician tells you, if you elect me, I will do the following things in the next 4 years, don't believe it. And you shouldn't want them to, because the chances are that the initial conditions will radically change within the space of 100 days, and the plan will be obsolete. We have one last remnant of the planning mentality in the United States at the Federal Reserve, because at the Fed they want you to believe that they will plan the future of interest rates. This is forward guidance. It's a last vestige of the classic 20th century belief that political actors can control the future. The real lesson of the 21st century is that that's not possible. We need to be short-termist because the powerful networks that are disrupting traditional hierarchies keep changing the environment and making our plans obsolete. So I actually don't accept the premise of this discussion, that we should all be long-termists, and if only we could be more like the Chinese, we'd have better roads. I think this is a misunderstanding. It's a misunderstanding also of China. The Chinese system is far more dysfunctional than people in the West realize. It's true that the United States has a great degeneration problem, but the Chinese do too. Maybe they're more aware of it, and they're certainly working harder to address it. But a system which does not have the rule of law is a fundamentally unstable system. And nobody should imagine that the China we see today is a role model. It isn't. We must hope that they can address that fundamental institutional deficit that is currently, I think, their greatest weakness. There's absolutely no guarantee they're going to be able to do it, and certainly not within the structure of a traditional 5-year plan.
First of all, I don't think anyone here said China is a wonderful role model, just to be clear.
But the idea is that there's something admirable about their long-term planning.
Yeah, well, this is my question for you. So in that kind of environment where things are constantly changing, things are constantly in transition, how do you deal with things like savings rate? How do you build a bullet train if it's going to take 10 years to finance it, et cetera? I mean, it's not a question of politicians promising things. how do you govern? How do you make decisions and move things forward? You can't change your mind every 3 days. I mean, that's what institutions will respond to that necessity?
By the way, Nathan, just a quick point. If you wanted to finance the bullet train, you could charge everyone who wants admission to this country $500,000 to $1 million, and you would finance your bullet train.
Okay. I'll give
There
that.
are so many- I'm
I'll
serious.
give that
I mean-
advice to Jerry Brown.
No, but it's true, because you find infrastructure, for example, being done in different cities
Right.
under a policy that allows people to gain residential status.
Yeah.
So it just speaks to the issue that there are lots of people who are voting with their feet and their dollars to come to this form of governance to bet on our balance sheet.
Yeah,
But
well,
it is
I
a valid-
hesitated to use the bullet train, but I did, because I knew that you can pick on the bullet train. But my point is, it could be anything. It could be energy efficiency standards. It could be emission standards.
So the
So
fundamental...
how in this network world that's shifting, how do you deal with those longer term issues?
The fundamental problem that the state has is that its balance sheet is not a transparent thing that we can read. The best arguments for investment in infrastructure would be possible if one could see clearly what the balance sheet of the federal government is. But that's not something that the system of public financial accounting allows. So one of the arguments I make in The Great Degeneration, because it's a book that recommends action, it's not a declinist book, it says these are the fixable problems, is we need to change the way that public finance is accounted for. Because the measures that we're obsessed with, deficits as a percentage of gross domestic product, net debt, or debt in public hands, these are arbitrary measures that really are meaningless. This is a point Larry Kotlikoff at Boston University has been making for years. What business would account for itself in those ways? It's really Enronized finance. So if one had a meaningful system of public finance which took into account the huge unfunded liabilities of the public sector, that would be terrifying. This is why the politicians do not want to do it. One could also look at the other side of the balance sheet. It would be a little less terrifying if we were aware of what actually were the assets of the United States, Inc. The reason these sorts of major infrastructure investments don't happen in democracies is essentially a function of public accounting, which is a completely warped system of assessing the viability of investment.
Yeah.
I want to go on to Frank, and we're going to even broaden the discussion further. But Mario, do you have any reflections on this?
One for each.
Oh, good.
To
Don't take too long,
no, okay.
because we're not in the long term now.
To Mitchell, it's cheap to assist and prevent rather than having to remedy afterwards. This is the lesson one can.
Right. I think we agree, right?
I agree. And I would like to interpret in this way something that Europe did, that the US encouraged Europe to do rather fast, that is the enlargement to the Central and Eastern European countries. Many Europeans believe, or believed until a few months ago, that Europe had been too fast in that process, both from the point of view of changes in the structures of those countries and from the point of view of Western public opinions getting accustomed to that. I've always been of the view that it was right to do it at that time, that is rather quickly in historical perspective, and with the Russian bear, as we now see him, I think that was a fitting example of that it is cheap to assist. To Neil, we need to be short-termist. I will have to reflect at least a few hours on that. But can't we also make a distinction? I mean, let's suppose you are right, we need to be short-termist. Don't we still have to make a decision between leadership and followership, even in the short term? Because many politicians are, not only are they short-termist, but their comparative advantage is the ability to read what people want. And in most cases, unfortunately, the things that people want are harmful to people, if we believe that there is also a longer term.
Can I very quickly answer?
Yeah, no, please.
Because it seems to me another way of looking at this is that the typical time horizon is both too long, as I would say, but also too short. Our biggest problem in democracies is that the young and the unborn are not represented.
Yes.
And leadership used to be about persuading the present generation to take account of the interests of the young and the unborn, posterity. Politicians used to talk a lot about that. They no longer do. In the age of the baby boomers, something extraordinary flipped in our culture. My grandfathers fought in the world wars, and they did so consciously for posterity, for the freedom of their children and grandchildren, and so forth. Since the wars, in the age of the baby boomers, we consumed at the expense of future generations. And democracy is not at all well designed to cope with that fundamental preference for present consumption over the interests of future generations. So when I was being somewhat paradoxical and saying, beware those who promise 5-year plans, let's be aware of this week's problems, I want to add to that. We need politicians who take the very, very long view and are prepared to act, not for 5 years, not for the next bloody election, but for the interests of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. That is what is most conspicuously absent from Western political discourse. We now have a vocabulary which is totally debased. This is a remnant of class conflict. We don't talk about class anymore because notionally everybody's in the middle class, but we do talk about percentiles, as if the only distributional contest today is between the 1% and everybody else. But the real distributional contest is between generations. And we do not have a good vocabulary for that. Indeed, our politicians have lost the ability to appeal to the interests of the unborn. That's the kind of leadership we need, and it's, in most countries, conspicuous by its absence.
Yeah, I think I was trying to, Maury and I discussed this during the Italian period, but I was trying to allude to that with this idea of consumer democracy. It's a bias towards the present and the immediate. Daniel Bell, the sociologist, talked long ago about the cultural contradictions of capitalism, that the idea of deferred gratification would be substituted by the consumption bias. And that's precisely what deprives this posterity dimension from politics. Now, Neil, though, in your in the earlier book you did on the apps, the apps that made the West successful,
yeah.
And not that you looked at China as a model, but that China was successfully adapting these apps, and therefore doing it contributed to its rapid growth in the global economy. We once thought, I suppose, if you take a Tom Friedman famous phrase about the flat world, that when there was economic convergence, when the emerging economies were rising, that the convergence of patterns of growth, a large global middle class, would somehow lead to a flat world that was harmoniously interdependent in some way. And in fact, we've seen the opposite. We've seen the convergence is leading to divergence. That as countries become more strong economically, they assert themselves culturally, politically, and militarily. We see it in Russia. We certainly see it in China. We see it in neo-Ottoman Turkey, perhaps. So along with this convergence now comes a divergence. And that brings us to the issue of the global governance issues. Is this idea we have of interdependence and harmony is reminiscent to many people of the talk in April 1914 before World War broke out in June. That interdependence was too great for this kind of conflict to emerge. And we've seen now in the East China Sea, we've seen obviously in Crimea that this idea is pretty fragile. So Frank, I'm sure you have maybe comments on the other things, but why don't you, if you have something on the other stuff, say it, and then let's hear what you think about what are the gaps in global governance, what are the vacuums of power that need to be filled on the global governance level?
Well, I think the world is changing in front of our eyes right now. I think this idea that globalization and interdependence would automatically buy political peace was always an illusion. I mean, this is the Norman Angell hypothesis right on the eve of World War I. And I think that politics proceeds on a very different track. And so what you see all over the world is a significant rise of nationalism. And in fact, it's the growth of the global economy that's fueled this, because in China's case, they're not any more aggressive or imperialistic than any other country. They're just big. They're just big, and they've gotten much bigger after the financial crisis in 2007-8. The West, United States and Europe, did very badly. They survived and continue to grow at very high rates, and they say to themselves, look, we were always a great power. We suffered this century of humiliation. Now we're back, and nobody wants to recognize that. And so it's a direct function of the prosperity brought about by globalization that you now have this big imbalance of power growing in East Asia. Russia is not as powerful, but they recovered. They recovered from the 1990s, and they now, I think, have set a terrible precedent. And I am not the least. I mean, if George Friedman said it's all going to be over in 10 years, I think he's wrong, because I think they've really they've upended the post-Cold War territorial settlement in Eastern Europe, and we're going to be paying and it's not us so much, it's the people that live in that part of the world that are going to be paying a very heavy price for this. Now, to use the word, well, what are the gaps in global governance? I think that's the wrong framework to think about this stuff, because global governance is the word you use for the G20, how to manage, international capital flows in this nice economic interdependent world. I think we're back to a geopolitical world. This is an argument that our colleague Walter Russell Mead has made fairly strongly, that old-fashioned geopolitics is back, and when you talk about global governance, actually what you need are a bunch of strategic military alliances at this point, I think. And so what kind of global governance do you need to deal with Russia? Well, I think we need to take NATO seriously. In fact, the problem with NATO up until now, I mean, since the end of the Cold War, the trouble is that we've regarded NATO as a global governance institution. It's just kind of a club of democracies, and if you get in, you're certified as a democracy, and we stopped thinking about it as a military alliance. And I think we got to do that again, because Estonia has 30% Russian-speaking population, just like many of Russia's neighbors. They're all going to be vulnerable to those same kinds of calls, revanchist calls to reunite with Russia. And we have not had a serious, military exercise trying to figure out how you defend any of these countries, given that we made that very solemn commitment. I think in East Asia, I just think that the economists and the business community have got their heads in the sand, because there's been such a big increase in nationalism in China, Japan, and Korea over the past 3-4 years. It's really, really scary. And so typically people will say, well, and this is the Norman Angell logic, that it's completely irrational for anybody to get into a fight over these rocks, in the Western Pacific, but it was irrational for anyone to get into, August 1914, start of World War I. And I can imagine many scenarios in which you would have short-term military conflict in that region that would have devastating consequences. And again, you don't need global governance. I think what you need is a multilateral mechanism to resolve territorial disputes that will box China in. And that's kind of what the struggle in East Asia is right now, that the Chinese just want to deal with everyone on a bilateral basis, because then they can strong-arm everybody. And so what I think we need is kind of a certain degree of solidarity, which means Japan and Korea have to stop, the stupid, fighting, and we need to work closely with ASEAN and revive, some of the existing mechanisms that are out there.
Let me go back to, I want to bring it back to democracy and what the public's willing to do and what they're willing to support or not support. Recently, Condi Rice said in an interview with the World Post that we all thought that when she was criticizing Obama, say that when Obama came to power, everything would be fine if we just backed off from the world, the good guys would fill the gaps. And in fact, it's the nationalists and the populists and neo-fascists that are filling the gaps. So yesterday, Obama's defending himself, not just against Condi Rice, but other people saying, you're not doing what you're saying, actually, And Obama says, well, we fought 2 exhaustive wars, and the polls are with Obama. The people say, I don't want to go fight for Ukraine. Frank Fukuyama
Yeah.
and those crazy neoconservatives want us to go to war again. So a democracy, unlike after World War II, when the public trusted elites enough to build an international system, we don't have that now. So that's one question. And the other one is related is, well, that one first. And then
Yeah, so
anybody else who wants to throw in.
The democracy thing is a red herring. This is just a question of leadership. There's no reason. So, you know, the United States has gone through these cycles. After Vietnam, we also got tired of extended involvements, and you had the Carter administration, and then, you know, Ronald Reagan turned things around. If you read the poll data on the eve of that 1980 election, most Americans were, you know, they wouldn't come to the defense of our NATO allies, even though we committed ourselves. But you know, you put a different argument out there, and you just do it. And I think in terms of financial resources, there's no reason that we couldn't afford a more, you know, we don't want a militarized policy, but we have the resources to have a policy that shows solidarity with other democratic countries around the world. The deficit will be fixed by entitlement reform. It will not be fixed on the back of the defense budget. There's just no way that that's going to happen. And therefore, I think, you know, with the right domestic policies and the right international leadership, there's absolutely no reason why the United States shouldn't play the kind of role it's traditionally played, I think, since the end of World War II.
Neil?
I mean, I agree with Frank. I think the president makes a very bad argument, and he did it in a very thin-skinned and defensive response to a question yesterday. Every time anybody suggests the mere threat of military force, he says you want to do Iraq again. But nobody's proposing to do Iraq in the case of Ukraine. Nobody was proposing to do Iraq in the case of Syria. So this defense is wearing thin. In practice, what the president has done has been to take even the threat of military force off the table. He stood up in September and gave an astonishing press conference, or rather address to the nation, in which he argued for not taking action against Assad, despite the fact that Assad had crossed his own red line on the use of chemical weapons. And that sent an extraordinarily bad signal to the rest of the world. He said it twice in that address: the United States is not the global policeman. If you keep telling people that the United States is not the global policeman, it's rather similar to saying the LAPD will not be patrolling the streets of LA this year. And that's essentially what we've seen. Since that address, the incentives for aggression have gone up. Even now, with Russia playing a kind of 1930s style system of disruption on Ukraine's eastern frontier, having annexed Crimea with impunity, what does the president have to offer? Tighter sanctions. And yet there were perfectly credible military options on the table. At the very least, a meeting of NATO leaders, at the very least, the deployment of some US naval assets to make Putin consider the possibility that there might be some military risk to what he was doing. But there was no military risk. There still is no military risk to what Putin is doing. I think it's an extremely lamentable show of weakness that we are currently dealing with. And I've said before, and I'll repeat it today, the geopolitical taper is far more serious than the Fed taper. We are tapering American power, and already the consequences are clear. And I totally agree with Frank. The really scary scenario is what happens in East Asia as a consequence of this geopolitical taper, as both Japan feels insecure and China feels provoked. I think the 2014-1914 parallel is helpful in one way at least. Many people try to draw this analogy who don't know 1914 well. I know it well. The key problem in 1914 was that Britain did not make it clear to its quasi-allies what it was going to do, nor did it make it clear what it was going to do to the Germans. And the uncertainty of the summer of 1914, which ultimately produced war in August, not June. June was the assassination, August was the war, was because the dominant English-speaking empire of the day thought it was too weak to have a credible strategy. Its strategy failed disastrously in 1914, and I worry that in the same way, a strategy of weakness on the part of the United States is going to have a disastrous, epic fail, maybe this year, maybe in 2014.
On this point, Look, having gone through my father's stories of World War II, Vietnam, where we had to make decisions. We were wondering whether we were going to get drafted. I understand the whole issue of what it is I'd never served, but being worried about your future and what you're going to do and thinking about it. So it's not a small decision to ramp up military thoughts, action strategies, and to show strength. But when you look at the broader balance sheet of the United States, as we were talking about, what I find lacking, and perhaps it's in the works, is this notion of trying to give Western Europe, and Mario, you could probably speak to this, energy independence from Russia. There are so many opportunities to start that, and it is so vital to the economy of Russia. As we saw in the 90s, when the price of oil started going down, liquidity drained from Russia with such rapidity, it was breathtaking. No amount of money that the Western powers could put into Russia could save it, right? We have, between sustainable strategies plus natural gas, what's going on in the United States, plus what Israel has discovered in the ability perhaps to put a pipeline to Cyprus and then feed the rest of the Mediterranean and Europe. You have lots of alternatives. None of this is being articulated in a way that is somewhat cautionary for Russia and preemptive as to their current actions. Now, the Eurozone a lot better than I do. I mean, energy independence in a lot of different ways is a key source of military security, right? And isn't it possible within the next 2 to 5 years for Europe to diversify its energy sources and develop an independence that would allow it to take more flexible actions in respect to Russia's actions?
Yes, but we need a common energy policy which contemplates diversification. So far, I must admit, we have a diversified energy policy which does not allow for such a real planning. But are you optimistic? I'm no energy expert. Are you optimistic also on the ability of the US to contribute substantially?
Cheniere, for example, has a license to do another LNG plant. I know Israel is working with perhaps Cyprus to develop a pipeline, and I'm sure there's plenty of people in this audience and at the conference who could speak to the specifics of energy diversity, particularly with respect to natural gas. Yeah. And I know that a few actions have been taken. But wouldn't it be great if somebody articulated a coherent energy independence strategy between the United States, Europe?
Yes.
I mean, that would send a real cautionary signal to Russia.
Absolutely.
I will say that in the wake of the Ukraine crisis, the Polish Prime Minister Tusk has proposed an energy union for Europe. And Merkel has agreed. But as Mario points out, you've got a very diversified energy grid, from nuclear to all kinds of renewables. And even Germany, before the crisis, was pulling back.
But this is where what Mario, you were saying before about certain decisions, right, at the higher level in Brussels, for example, this is where action could be taken, particularly in conjunction with perhaps NATO.
Let me go back. We've got about 6.5 minutes. I want to just come back to a couple of questions on the geopolitical front. When the G7 kicked out Russia from the G8, talking about the shifting world order, the so-called BRICS, China, Russia, India, South Africa, said we're not going to do this in the G20. We're not going to isolate Russia. How does that play into this ability of the U.S. to lead and to show that it's a powerful country still, when all these emerging economies we've been celebrating for the last 2 decades are now saying we're not going to play that game?
Well, there's been a steady erosion of American ability to use things like sanctions to get its ways, and this started way before the current crisis. So if you look at Sudan, we tried to sanction Sudan, for 20 years over terrorism and Darfur and so forth, and you couldn't do it because the Chinese were backfilling and willing to, fund any project that we pulled out of. So I think what it does is it weakens our ability to shape events. On the other hand, the BRICS is not. It's not a political movement. It's just an acronym thought up by a securities analyst. I mean, they have no.
No offense.
They have no natural.
Financial security analyst.
Financial security, yes.
They have no natural commonality of interest, except that all of them are vaguely anti-American and enjoy, rubbing America's nose in the fact that we can't, get our way all the time. But between Russia and China, there are territorial issues. There are major, issues of population along their border. Brazil is basically a democracy and has, very different kinds of moral interests from the Chinese and so forth. And so that's the one respect in which I think the world really is very different, that you don't have a systematic underlying clash of big ideas right now going on. What you've got is a lot of different countries with their own national interests, their own nationalisms. And so in some ways, we are kind of returning to a 19th century world where you don't have big bifurcations, but you've got a lot of little centers of power. The question, I guess the global governance question is, how do you manage that? And I think one of the issues, that the way it was managed in the 19th century was actually not through formal agreements, but by maintaining a balance of power among these different power centers. And that actually produced a reasonably moderate world. It broke down by the time of World War I because one of those powers got to be so big. But, so there are natural balancing mechanisms, I think, that are out there, even apart from these formal institutions.
Let me give that last question to Neil, since you're working on this biography of Kissinger, and balance of power and Kissinger are synonymous in most people's minds. But Kissinger also is very much into cooperation and coordination with China and avoiding conflict between the U.S. and China, maybe so far as a G2 even. What are your thoughts on instead of ramping up the conflict with China, in some kind of a condominium with China?
Well, anybody who's read Kissinger on China knows that the final part of the argument makes an explicit reference to 1914. He quotes the famous Air-Crow Memorandum, which was the famous memorandum by a British diplomat arguing that the rise of Germany was the biggest challenge that the United Kingdom faced. And I think in the same way, he rightly argues that the rise of China is the biggest challenge that US foreign policy faces. And we do not have a coherent strategy. Now, you can call it the G2, or if you prefer my term, Chimerica. The relationship between China and America is the most important relationship for our world today. If that goes wrong, then all bets are effectively off. I worry that we do not yet have a coherent strategy, and currently we are doing a kind of containment light, judging by the president's recent tour, which isn't credible. And I think to do containment light without credibility is the worst possible strategy, because you neither reassure your allies really. I don't think the Japanese have felt much reassurance from the president's recent visit, but at the same time you irk and antagonize the rising power. The argument in Kissinger's book is for what he calls co-evolution, which I take to mean an accommodation of China's rise. And I have to say that the lesson of history is pretty clear. That must be preferable to collision. And if there's one thing we should all fervently wish to avoid, that's more obvious on the Pacific coast than on the Atlantic coast, it's that kind of collision that ultimately brought Britain and Germany to world war not once but twice. So it seems to me extraordinary but true that a man approaching his 91st birthday still has the most profound things to say about the international system and is still offering a more coherent strategy for the United States than the president or his national security advisors seem capable of devising.
Okay, I'm going to end this conversation just by bringing it all back to the beginning with a question. We don't have time to answer, but we can go on debating it. Maybe we will. I'm not convinced, Frank, that it's a matter of leadership. We live in a consumer society. We live in a society of networks. We live in a society that's, in some ways, a diet culture. We want sweetness without calories. We want consumption without savings. We want world order and security without war, without military spending. So democracy is inextricably linked to the ability of the U.S. to play a leading role in this current environment. And I'm not convinced that the public is where Frank Fukuyama is. That's an open question. We'll leave it at that unless someone has an answer real quick. Okay, good. Thank you very much.
Okay.